ومن يؤمن بالله يهد قلبه
ونصلي ونسلم على خير خلق الله أجمعين المبعوث رحمة للعالمين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. We praise Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and send peace and blessings upon His Messenger sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, his family and his companions. I asked the brother to give me a couple of extra minutes, inshallah. I thought while we're all waiting here, inshallah ta'ala, seeing as so this is a very light discussion, inshallah, and hopefully something not too heavy for you, having just eaten and inshallah before the Salatul Taraweeh. They asked me to talk, the brothers, wafaqahumullah, they asked me to talk about my journey with the Quran as a sort of a little filler for the time, inshallah ta'ala. And I thought really, I can't really talk about my journey with the Quran without talking about my journey to Islam in the first place. And a lot of brothers asked me sort of, I tend to get this question more than anything when I'm sort of walking out of the masjid, how did you become a Muslim? And some of you may know that I became Muslim when I was 14 years old. So I don't have too much time to tell the story, and I normally tell it over a longer period of time. But I thought, subhanAllah, we sat here, inshallah, and we're waiting for the salah. So in the meantime, bi'idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala, it'd be beneficial just to talk a little bit about how I came to Islam, my sort of experience with the Quran, and some sort of practical tips or some sort of advice for whatever advice that I can give you regarding the Quran and regarding memorizing it and learning it and so on and so forth. Let's start at the beginning. I accepted Islam when I was 14 years old. And we have to start this story, even though very strictly this story is about the Quran, but I'll find a way to fit it in. This story has to start before that time, when I was about 12 or 13 years old. And I was going through a pretty difficult time in my life. I was pretty rebellious. I'd had a very bad relationship with my parents. I was the type of person who just wanted to rebel against everything and anything. So I wanted to rebel against authority. I wanted to rebel in the classroom. I was constantly getting in trouble in and out of school. I was a very sort of academic student in the sense that I achieved a great deal in terms of my grades and so on and so forth. But I always managed to accompany that with getting myself in a lot of trouble. And I used to do so more or less out of a desire to rebel. And if you want to put it another way, let's put it a way of a desire not to submit to anything, not to accept anything, just to rebel against everybody. So, like for example, I would take up smoking, for example, for the sake simply of annoying my parents. Not because I actually wanted to, or not because I liked it, but because I wanted to see the reaction from my parents. This was the kind of sort of time before I became Muslim and the kind of sort of mentality that I was having. I had a very bad group of friends. And now, as we speak, those friends some of them are in prison, some of them are in very, very bad situations, subhanAllah. And, I don't think they were bad people as such, but we got into sort of mischief, sort of minor crime, nothing serious, mostly, sort of throwing stones at windows and setting things on fire and that sort of thing. And this was the kind of situation that we were in. And it was a situation where I honestly felt, and now, we reflect upon the ayah when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَمَنْ أَعْرَضَ عَنْ ذِكْرِي فَإِنَّ لَهُ مَعِيشَةً ضَنْكًا. The one who turns away from my remembrance, he's going to have a very restricted, a very constricted, a very, very difficult and hard and sort of pressured life. And no matter what riches and what wealth Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives an individual, this is a principle that is absolutely unswerving. You turn away from the remembrance of Allah and you are subhanAllah going to have a hard and constricted life in this dunya and in the life of the barzakh and in the akhirah. So I sort of felt this. I felt that as a group of friends, we were constantly betraying each other. We were constantly sort of running away and leaving one person to take the blame. We would get into fights with each other. We would sort of leave each other on the side of the road. We would sort of do anything that we could to sort of betray and sort of be evil towards each other. There was a lot of backbiting. There was a lot of sort of trying to create trouble between people. And in this situation, I was a person, I think the other factor which played a major factor in my sort of coming to the Quran and to Islam, I guess, was probably the fact that I like to read. And my parents tell me that from a very young age, I was not a person who was particularly keen on the TV. I would much rather be read a story to, or a poem, or a nursery rhyme, or something like that, than I would to watch the TV. So I was particularly, keen on reading. And even from that age, I remember probably from the age of 11 or 12, I would read obsessively. I would go in my room and I'd gone through my dad's bookcase completely from beginning to end by the time I was probably 13. And in there were books on philosophy. I remember reading Sophie's World, and it's sort of an introductory book to philosophy when I was very, very young. That sort of deals with a little bit of religion. What religion, our purpose in life, and sort of things like that from the point of the philosophers at least. I remember reading books in which religion played a major part. And I was never, as far as I can remember, averse to the concept of God. I was never I never went through a stage where I didn't believe that God existed. I just didn't know who God was. I believed very firmly, and I remember being in sort of 11 or 12, and when I wanted something really strongly, I remember I would pray and I would say, oh God, please, can I really, really want this particular thing. Of course, it was all worldly things like, I wanted a new something or other, or I wanted some money, or I wanted something or other. But I remember distinctly events when I was sort of in year 7, year 8, sort of, younger than when I became Muslim. And in this sort of age, I remember distinctly praying. Even though I didn't know who I was praying to and I didn't know what I was doing, but I was very firm on the concept of God. And because I like to rebel, I also like to rebel against my parents' and everyone else's concept of religion as well. So I was very much sort of skeptical. I was very, very skeptical of other people's beliefs. I sort of had that kind of, almost a sort of a pride that, I knew better and all these people didn't know what they were talking about. And so it gave me a sort of a, if you like, an impetus or something to motivate me to actually start to read. And I remember being distinctly unhappy with Protestant Christianity, mostly because it doesn't make any sense. And I still believe that today, and I still say that to all the Christians I meet, that Protestant Christianity makes absolutely no sense at all. And especially the Trinity makes no sense. And subhanAllah, this is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about in the Quran, people who have eyes that they don't see with, and ears they don't hear with, and hearts that they don't think with, subhanAllah, it doesn't make any rational sense to anybody. And it didn't make any to me. And because I was in that sort of mode of rebellion, I was more than happy to sort of reject it and ignore it and turn away from it. Briefly, I looked at Catholicism, more or less because I saw the Catholics were sort of practicing a bit more. At least they go to church on a Sunday. I mean, my parents probably really only went to church when there was a wedding or a funeral. Possibly my grandmother would have taken me to church a couple of times when I was younger, Sunday school a couple of times, but nothing really serious. Church was something much like all the Christians are essentially murji'ah, in the sense that they all believe that, your iman will save you. And, you're in your heart and there's no action. You don't have to act. Just, keep it in your heart, believe in Jesus and you'll be saved, and it doesn't matter what else you do. So in that kind of mentality, there's really no point in coming to church, right? Because you wouldn't go to church to learn something when you don't have to go. And there's no difference in paradise if you go to church or you don't go to church. So I didn't bother, like most children wouldn't and don't today. I looked into Catholicism because I basically thought that Catholicism, the Catholics seem to practice a bit more. They seem to be a bit sort of more energetic. They kind of said you have to go to church once a week. I thought, all right, I have to go somewhere, I have to do something. But I found Catholicism to make even less sense than Protestant Christianity. Catholicism is even more ridiculous in terms of the saint worship, in terms of, oh Father, forgive me, I have sinned, when the Father probably has far more sins than you will ever have in your entire life. And I just, subhanAllah, like I couldn't bring myself to submit to somebody like that. I couldn't bring myself to, to go into a booth and to say to somebody, "You human being, forgive me." And I don't think I had a particular thing that I had to ask God, or it felt all wrong. And I mean, I would say now this is sort of the fitrah, the natural inclination of mankind to worship God alone, and maybe a bit of my rebellious sort of nature as well. So I gave that up pretty quickly. And then I thought for a while, I looked at sort of the Eastern religions, which are very mystic, but again, I didn't really find very much substance. I looked into Buddhism for a while, and I didn't really find very much. And I don't think I was reading these that I'm gonna read this so that I want to convert to another religion. I was just sort of searching for a purpose in life, for a reason why these things were happening to me, why I was so badly depressed, why I was so, not happy, why things were bad with the parents, why me? And so, I looked into a few different answers. I looked into Buddhism, and I found that really it doesn't really contain anything. Sort of meditate, believe in God, don't believe in God, hedge your bets, say 50-50. That kind of stuff, it didn't really work for me. And also the idea of reincarnation was even more ridiculous than the ideas in Christianity and Protestantism and Catholicism. So I sort of thought the idea of reincarnation, that I would come back as a little stone if I was bad, or even worse, that you're reincarnated as a rat or something like that. This was something very, very, very incomprehensible, and it didn't make sense, because quite clearly the dogs and the cats and the rats and so on and so forth were not human beings with intellect who sort of were once human beings, and it didn't make any sense to me, and it didn't really even try to make sense. Likewise, I read about Eastern religion, I read some of philosophy, I read some of the sort of answers as to why we're here, down to the thing of God has abandoned us, and that's why, or there's a, and specifically in Catholicism, I got this whole idea of this war that is going on. This war that's going on between God and the devil, and we just don't know who's going to win. And I thought, this is ridiculous, this is crazy. SubhanAllah, the all-powerful, almighty God doesn't know whether he can beat this pathetic devil who he created. And so, SubhanAllah, you find these people almost have two gods, a God of good and a God of evil. And so there's a war going on, and everything that happens from the devil. And of course, we came across the same issue, the issue that only Islam answers. So if the devil is the cause of evil, then how is it that God allows evil to happen? And all of these things going through my mind, and I sort of just rejected them all. And I came to sort of the conclusion that they were all wrong, and I would just sort of continue with what I had, and I sort of left it at that. Things got a bit better. I moved to high school. I don't know whether you guys have this in Birmingham, but in Newcastle we have 3 schools, primary, middle, and high. So from year 8 to year 9, you move school. So I moved school, and in this school, I found some better friends. I sort of started to be a bit better, and I sort of abandoned my philosophical reading to a certain extent. And what happened was, I started to go to RE lessons. Part of the national curriculum. We had a neo-Buddhist sort of female teacher. She might have been called Mrs. White. And she was not very friendly towards Islam. She used to love to tell the students to put up their hand, how many of you pray 5 times a day? Of course, you're asking a bunch of 13-year-olds. Okay, now, alhamdulillah, maybe our kids, inshallah, 13-year-olds hopefully say, yeah, we pray 5 times a day. But, you're asking a bunch of 13-year-olds in a city that doesn't have a massive Muslim population, doesn't have any Muslim schools. Most of them did not sort of have any concept of hijab. There was probably 1 girl in the school that wore hijab, maybe 2. It was not sort of a, it was a very, very distant from Islam. So most people would say no. She would say, your parents, how often does your dad pray? He prays once a day. He prays Jum'ah. He prays on a Friday. And she would say, yeah, see, this is Islam. Wonderful in theory, but Muslims don't practice it. And I just remember thinking, well, that doesn't really sort of count, because we can't really judge Islam by what the Muslims do, but we need to judge Islam by what Islam is. So I remember sort of being taught the basics of Islam. And she would say, right, comparative religion, sort of God in the 3 major Semitic religions, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. What is the concept of God? And I remember I think the fact that she didn't believe in any of them helped. because she didn't come and sort of push Christianity down our throat. She came from the principle that Christianity didn't make any sense. And that helped a lot. So she came and said, the Trinity, 3 is 1, 1 is 3, this doesn't make any sense. Judaism, you've got one rule for you and then another rule for you. Like the rule for the rabbis and the rule for you, and then the rabbis just re-legislate. And she went through all of that. And then she went, and the Muslims believe in one God and one God alone. And we know what Muslims are like. And sort of continued on with things like that. But the thing that struck me was that the concept of God in Islam was something that I could accept and something that I could submit to completely. I felt one God, all-powerful, wills everything to happen, knows everything. Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. I can completely accept that. And I suppose this is the beginning of the sort of alarm bells that started to sort of ring in my head, or the sort of like feeling of something, hold on a minute. So then she went through sort of punishment, and she went through in Islam, she went through the 5 pillars, she went through the prayer, and I thought, okay, here we have some people who have to pray. To attain salvation, they have to pray. They have to go to the mosque and they have to pray. Brilliant, makes perfect sense. Don't know how I'm going to pray 5 times a day. It's very, very difficult. 5 times seems an awful long time to pray to me, but that makes sense. Praying all the time, constantly in touch with God, constantly in sort of building a relationship with God, talking to God, sort of praying, supplicating, perfect sense. So it sort of registered with me. Zakat, thought wonderful. Much better than tax. Tax is absolutely horrible and oppressive. Everyone hates to pay tax. Nobody hates to pay zakat. Everyone loves to pay zakat. Zakat is so easy to pay, you don't even notice it go out of your account. I mean, you keep something for a year, then obviously you didn't have a great deal of need for it. And then, you pay 2.5%, which is nothing anyway. And subhanAllah, you look at if the world's sort of 20 or 30 richest people paid zakat, it would effectively erase world poverty completely. And subhanAllah, you see the sort of Western style of dealing with charity, which is that we give charity with one hand and we take it with the other. We give it with one hand, but it's in the form of riba that you have to sort of pay back, and the country will be forever enslaved to the banks and the financial institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and all the rest. And then you have the Muslim system. Zakah, fi sabilillah, bismillah, take it, eat with it, feed your family, those in need. And it made perfect sense to me. Went through the Hajj, thought no problem with that. It's not like you're going to worship an idol, you're going to worship God, makes perfect sense. And basically, she was very factual about what Islam was, while having little digs at the Muslims all the way through. But that sort of factual explanation of Islam began to make me sort of think. And actually, it got to the point where I started to recognize that whenever she talked about Islam, something changed in here, and I want to go and look at it. So I went home and I straight on the internet. And of course, you get so much rubbish on the internet when you start looking for things about Islam on the internet. But that's what happened. And a lot of what I found was true, and some of it was false, and some of it was good, and some of it was bad. And you can imagine the kind of groups like the Ahmadiyya and the Shia and all the rest who sort of have websites when you type in Islam and hit enter. But it started to make me think. And here's where we come to the actual thing that I've been asked to talk about. The Quran. It started to make me think particularly about the Quran. And I don't remember actually reading the Quran before I became Muslim. I don't think I did. I might be wrong because I can't remember very well. I was very young. But I don't think I read the Quran when I was, before I became Muslim. But I heard about the Quran. And the first thing I heard about the Quran is this is a book that has only one version, Arabic. Thought, makes perfect sense. God's going to send a book. What is that book going to be like? Let's just take for a second that the Muslims are telling the truth. This book is the book of Allah, speech revealed by God. So let's have a look. What is this book going to be like? First of all, it's going to be a pretty amazing book. It's going to be divine. So it's not going to be your average kind of book. It's going to contain everything that everyone would need, past, present, and future. Not that it was all right sort of in the 15th century, or that it was all right in whenever or wherever, likewise like you have with Christianity, which sort of worked for a while and then failed miserably when science proved it completely wrong, and all of the stuff that went on with that, and the concepts, and it became irrelevant to the people. And sort of I looked at and I thought, if this book is from God, it's not going to be irrelevant. It's going to be absolutely relevant, because one of the things is that God is all powerful, omnipotent, that God is able to do anything, and so his book is going to be absolutely relevant to my life today. It's not going to be a collection of stories. Jesus went down to the river, ﷺ, and he put something in the river, and then he came back. The end. And that we're supposed to take from that what? That we're supposed to go down to the river every day, or that we're supposed to put things in the river, or don't go to the river, or if you go to the river, make sure you... It makes absolutely no sense at all. It's just stories. But the Quran was something different. Halal, haram, do this, don't do this. If you do this, this will happen. If you don't do this, this will happen. Very clear. The next thing is the sort of infallibility of the Quran, the fact that the Quran has no mistakes in it. Very simple. One of the Muslims pointed out the very first or second ayah in Surah Al-Baqarah, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ. I thought, who starts a book with, this book has nothing wrong with it. This book is absolutely perfect, except God, because either that person's going to look very, very stupid when people see that the book is full of mistakes, or start criticizing the language, or start saying, well, it wasn't great. But if it is really from God, and it says at the beginning, this is a book that has no doubt in it, that is absolutely perfect in every sense, then surely, this book's been around a long time, somebody would have critiqued this book. So that's where I started going, right, now let me have a look at the people who critiqued this book, the people who actually criticized the Quran. So I started to type, what's wrong with the Quran, and I found some Christian missionary websites. And I sort of found there all of their sort of what we call shubuhat, all of their doubts and misguidance and stuff that they push to the people. And I read it openly and went through it. And I would never advise anybody to do that, but that was me before I knew any better. I went through it, and subhanAllah, I went through it, and some things I made a note of. I thought, okay, it's pretty serious. Quran has error in here, in here, in here. Let's see what the Muslims have to say. And when I looked at what the Muslims had to say, I found that the Muslims, when it came to the Quran, had a clear, plain and simple answer for everything that those people said. And that answer, more importantly, was verifiable. They could say, that's not a grammatical mistake because of this poetry, and this poetry, and this poetry, and this poetry. Hear it in daylight. You can have a look at it. It was all written before the Quran. It all uses the same grammatical syntax. Therefore, this argument is baseless. Thought, brilliant. In fact, then I sort of looked at the guy who's criticizing this is not an Arab with no knowledge of Arabic, and he's criticizing the language of the Quran, whereas the scholars of the Quran, of the Arabic language, didn't find any criticism in it. Neither did the enemies of the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And then, I sort of looked into the Prophet ﷺ, and again, I looked into some of the things that were said about him. And again, I found that everything that was said had a clear answer for it. And the answer was unashamed. It was not, nobody sort of concealed the answer. Nobody sort of said, oh, you can't, in Christianity, if you ever know anything about Christianity, your only hope of surviving Christianity is to be as ignorant as possible. Knowledge is a punishment. Because the more knowledge you have, and I say this to any Christian, and I challenge any Christian on this, any Christian pastor, any vicar, any priest, subhanallah, Christianity, you can only get through it with ignorance. That's why they're called ad-dalun, because you can't get through Christianity without ignorance. The pastor will say to you, the vicar will say to you, say, vicar, so I see in here that you say this about the Prophet Lut, and you say this about the Prophet Ibrahim, and you say this about Sulaiman. You shouldn't ask these questions, okay? It's better just to have faith, okay? Just have iman, same thing, murji'ah again, this irja that comes through with them. Just have the faith, don't worry about anything else. Say, look, Trinity doesn't make any sense. 3 doesn't equal 1, 1 doesn't equal 3. Is it the Son? Is it the Father? If it's the Son, how come he died? It's better you don't ask these questions. Just have faith. Believe in Jesus, he'll guide you. So I've spent sort of 13 years believing in Jesus, and I'm still not getting this Trinity anymore. SubhanAllah, and it is based upon absolute ignorance. And listen to the stories. Listen to the story of Yusuf Estes. Listen to the stories of Joshua Evans and the likes, they'll tell you the same thing. And they knew more about Christianity than I did. They were themselves were active in calling people to Christianity, in practicing Christianity. Same thing, they go to the pastor, they go to the priest, he tells you, don't ask questions, stop asking things. This is, you're going to ruin your faith. And in Christianity, there's a principle that if you ask a question about the religion, it decreases your iman. It takes away from your iman. And I find in the Quran, وَقُلْ رَبِّ زِدْنِي عِلْمًا. Say, oh Allah, increase me in knowledge. Oh my Lord, increase me in knowledge. Anything you ask the Muslims, they would give you such a clear answer to. And anything you ask the Christians, they would sort of say, So you say, subhanAllah, you accuse the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ of X, Y, Z, but you believe that Ibrahim and Lut and Sulaiman and whatever all did the same. So does that not make him a prophet in your eyes? Since you claim the same things that you accuse him of, you accuse all of the prophets of. Except with the exception of Isa alayhi salam. And subhanAllah, they will say, yes, but and essentially what does it come down to? It comes down to the fact that he was an Arab. He wasn't from the place that they expected him to be from, and they had no other evidence other than this. And I started to think, and just sort of in my mind I had, well, to be honest, if you look at sort of all of the prophets, they were all sent from that sort of region broadly. All the ones we know about were sent from that sort of region, perhaps with the exception of a couple, but certainly the vast majority were sent from that sort of Middle Eastern region. So why wouldn't Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala send another prophet from that region? Likewise, what did that prophet bring? SubhanAllah, asked nothing for himself. Didn't seek any worldly gain. That leaves you with only one thing. If he didn't seek worldly gain, that means either he was suffering from insanity or either he's telling the truth. And everything about his life says that he was absolutely sane and he knew absolutely what he was doing. In fact, the Christians will tell you that he was absolutely sane and he knew what he was doing and he was very devious and so on and so forth. That's what they'll say about him. So you say, if you say he's sane and he's telling the truth and he doesn't take any advantage for himself, nothing at all. They say, oh, well, he had more than 4 wives. Say, subhanAllah, but who are they? The most beautiful, some women of the time, or that was of benefit to Islam. His marriages were of a benefit to spreading the message of Islam to more people. SubhanAllah, absolutely crystal clear. They had no answer. When they criticized the Quran, they had no answer. So in the end, I made the decision to accept Islam, and I sort of came and I read on the internet, and they told me you have to have 2 witnesses, which of course you don't. You can imagine someone on a mountain, subhanAllah, and he decides to accept Islam. And he's kind of in trouble, isn't he? Because he doesn't have any witnesses and he's sort of dying on a mountainside and he's like, I accept Islam, la ilaha illallah, please Allah, send us an angel or someone to bear witness. But subhanAllah, they told us you have to have 2 witnesses, otherwise you can't enter into Islam. So I went into my parents' room and I said, Mom and Dad, I've got something to read to you. And I read the Shahada in Arabic and they said, what's that? And I said, it's just something in Arabic I've learned. And then I left. And after a while, I told my parents, alhamdulillah, they were very, very understanding. They were very supportive. They sort of wanted to know why. I think my mum had guessed it for quite some time when she'd seen sort of 6 weeks of me sort of mixing with the Muslims and getting to know Islam. And that sort of led to what it led to. And I sort of went through, I'm having to cut short, but I went through a period of my life of not really practicing Islam very much. Between about 14 and sort of 18, mostly because I couldn't really find anyone to teach me. And this is a huge problem we have, and I absolutely criticize the Muslims for this, is that we are very good at getting people to become Muslim, and we are appallingly bad at actually helping them when they become Muslim. So what happens is like, take the Shahada, I want to take a Shahada, I want to take a Shahada, off you go, you want to take a Shahada, right, that's fine, okay, ma'asalama, see you later. And then don't talk to him, don't find out anything about him, never see him again. Next thing you know, he's gone off. And subhanAllah, this is a real problem and something we're working actively, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, to address with some other organizations, alhamdulillah. About this time, I heard about the Islamic University of Medina, and I made the decision to go there. I applied, I had a huge problem, found rejection everywhere I went, but alhamdulillah, in the end, I persevered, and bifadlillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala wa rahmatih, I was accepted into the university. A couple of minutes to talk a little bit about my advice. That's sort of my journey with the Quran, but sort of my advice as to how you go to approach the Quran. And I did a khutbah on this, and if I'm not mistaken, it might be on YouTube with a bit more detail. on this particular topic. But this is something I think is extremely important. Ramadan is the month of the Quran, and it's a month where we should be focusing particularly upon the Quran. I think that we need to focus on a number of things. The first thing I think it's vitally important that we focus on is that we focus on understanding the Quran and acting upon the Quran. Because wallahi, you can read and read and read, and mashallah, it is khatam of the Quran 10 times in Ramadan, 30 times in Ramadan. And subhanallah, it just goes over the head. So what we need people to do is to understand the Quran. Now, some brothers came to me last time I said this, and they said, Akhi Muhammad, we disagree with what you said. You're making it difficult for the people because you're making them understand the Quran, and we should just be getting people to read the Quran. And I still say, Ya Ikhwan, give some time. I'm not saying never ever read the Quran without reading the tafsir. Give some time of your Ramadan to read the tafsir in a language that you understand, and don't think that our brothers from the Arabs are exempt from this. They are not exempt from it. Read the tafsir, read Tafsir al-Sa'di, read something simple, very, very simple. Tafsir al-Sa'di is wonderful, and you have less of the aqidah problems that you have with Tafsir al-Jalalain. So stick to Tafsir al-Sa'di, very, very simple, just so that you make sure you really did understand the ayah as it was revealed, and not that you sort of misunderstood. And we heard in the talk earlier some of the wisdom of Al-Imam al-Sa'di, rahimahullah ta'ala. And those who are able to do a bit more, you have Ibn Kathir and so on and so forth. And really, try to understand the Quran. Why do you want to understand it? So that you can act upon it. So you can implement it. What did the companions of the Messenger of Allah ﷺ say? We did not used to go beyond 10 ayat until we memorized them and we acted upon them, we understood them. We did not used to memorize more than 10 ayat until we had understood them and acted upon what they contained. Two things, understand and act upon it. Next thing in my last sort of 2 minutes, inshallah, and very, very, very seriously and very importantly, when it comes to the Quran, spend some time to correct your recitation. And that applies to everybody, Imam down to, the new Muslim, everybody. Because everybody can improve, and everybody needs to improve. And subhanAllah, we send our children to tahfidh, and we're not content until our children pronounce the letters properly, and we ourselves are content not to pronounce the letters properly. So it's very important that we sort of focus on really working with the Quran. And in Medina, this is something, I had a wonderful Egyptian teacher, Shaykh Salah, hafidhahullah, and he, subhanAllah, pushed again and again. Don't sit with a teacher. Don't ever sit with a teacher who just says to you, yeah, mashallah, that's fine. If I sit with a teacher now, I want a teacher who says to me, you made 5 mistakes in this surah. It was terrible. Correct this and this and this and this. This is what you want. Someone who's going to push you to do better. Someone who's going to say, that wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough. That wasn't good enough. I remember reading, I think it was, he said to me, I remember sitting with one of the Shaykh's students, and he said to me, can you read قُلْ أَعُوذُ بِرَبِّ الْفَلَقِ. So I said, yeah, sure. He said, actually, we won't have time. I said, there's half an hour between now and Maghrib. What do you mean that we won't have time to read Al-Falaq? He said, we won't have time. I said, subhanAllah. He said, just read قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ. 14 mistakes he found. I said, I didn't think there was 14 words in this surah that I could have read wrong. 14 mistakes. He says, not going to read it again. And subhanAllah, they push you. And subhanAllah, like this, you improve and you develop. You need people to push you. And you yourself need to push yourself. And it's all about having, and the last thing I'll mention, because I'm over the time now, when it comes to the book of Allah, it's about having that respect and that honor of the speech of Allah Azza wa Jal. When you read it, it's not about finishing the Quran 30 times or 50 times or 10 times or 3 times. It's about finishing the Quran with hudu, like slowly and calmly and carefully and understanding and reflecting and even repeating an ayah for a while until you feel you really enters into your heart. This is the kind of thing that a person needs to do with the Quran, and this is the kind of thing, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, that's going to cause a real benefit to you, especially in this month of Ramadan. So those people who, for example, planning to finish the Quran in the last 10 days of Ramadan, for example, finish it in the last 10 days, but just give yourself a little time to understand it a little bit, to read the tafsir a little bit, to sort of reflect upon it, to recite it a little slower than you were going to. Maybe you think, well, I can finish a juz in 20 minutes. I tell you one thing, I can't finish a juz in anything less than 50 minutes. And I know one thing, my if I lead Salat al-Taraweeh, everyone gets annoyed with me. Because subhanAllah, like, I just can't do it quickly. It has to be long. So guys, like, reflect upon the Quran, think about it, and take your time, inshallah. I've gone over my time now, so that's all we have time for. Bi-idhnillahi tabaraka wa ta'ala. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك وصلى اللهم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.
ومن يؤمن بالله يهد قلبه